the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Bishop Conley is the Bishop of the Diocese of Lincoln, Nebraska. He's the author of this letter, I Future with Hope, a pastoral letter he issued for Mental Health Awareness Month in May of 2024. And in it, if you're not familiar with it, and I know many of you are, he shares his loss of joy and a diagnosis with PTSD, major depression, anxiety, and tinnitus. He also shares his experience on sabbatical from his seat in the Diocese of Lincoln and the discoverings and healing he has since received through friends, medical professionals, a golden retriever, just showing up, God, and grace. So, Bishop Conley, good morning, and thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning.
What happened in 2019?
Well, actually, I think we go back a year before that when things really began, which would be 2018. And 2018, maybe some folks remember some of the things that were happening that summer. It was the Cardinal McCarrick disclosure and the terrible tragedy of clergy sexual abuse was once again in the headlines, and all the pain that has caused, especially to victims. It's also the same summer that the Pennsylvania grand jury report came out, depicting all of the horrific scandals through that grand jury report in the state of Pennsylvania. And those two events in 2018, put the church back in the headlines in a very, tragic way. And like a lot of states, the state of Nebraska, kind of because of these things that were happening in the church, decided to launch a statewide investigation into historical clergy sexual abuse and subpoenaed all the dioceses, all three dioceses in the state of Nebraska to turn over their personnel files going back 40 years. And we had never really been, the state of Nebraska, there hadn't really been much, as far as public disclosure of things. And so that was all happening. And at the same time, I had several priests I removed for sexual misconduct. And then there was all that, kind of pressure in the diocese. There were several other things. We ended up having to close a couple of Catholic schools that had been kind of a process that had been going on for a couple of years. But that's always a very traumatic experience. You always hate to close a Catholic school. So I was dealing with that. My sister, on the personal side, my sister was diagnosed with breast cancer. And I had all these things sort of on my mind. And that's when the tinnitus started. I just woke up one morning in September of 18. I had this loud ringing in my ears, which came out of nowhere. But, I just kept forging on. And probably a lot of people do, you try to figure out ways to solve all these problems. And, having it on your mind, kind of running it through over and over, thinking mistakenly that, it's up to you to solve these things, whether you're, the head of a family or a company or a bishop or a parish priest or whatever, you kind of get this idea that you're supposed to fix everything, which was really kind of the first mistake that I made, is thinking that since I'm the bishop, it's up to me to, figure out these problems and come up with the solutions and the outcomes. Instead of
it's an understandable,
yeah,
as you say, given the seat you're in, and they are real problems, and in some ways the buck does stop with you.
Exactly. And, and of course, I mentioned this in my pastoral letter, that it's kind of written in our DNA too, especially for men. My father was a gunner on an aircraft carrier in World War II, and kind of typical of that great generation, came out and was very successful, played professional baseball. He's kind of my hero. And his whole philosophy of life was like so many. It's just you pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You work harder. And in my case, I would just pray harder, and I can fix all this stuff. And sort of as I called it, sort of an ungodly self-reliance. Instead of surrendering it all over to the Lord and acknowledging that He's the one in charge of outcomes. He's the one that can only heal and save us and solve these problems. So the first thing that started happening in the late fall of 18 was I began, kind of realizing it, but not sleeping. Either not sleeping soundly and then eventually not sleeping at all. Sort of just, going through all of these scenarios one by one and over and over. And I think I probably went, a couple of months without really getting a good night's sleep or any sleep at all. And then that sort of had an effect of, working on my body. As I mentioned in the letter, I'm a runner, and I kind of put that aside. I just didn't have the energy to go out and go for runs like I normally did, so I put that aside. And then I noticed, too, that I just wasn't eating much, and I started losing weight. And by the spring of 19, thanks to my sister and some close friends, it was recommended that I go get a full forensic physical up at the Mayo Clinic, and they have a great program up there, like a 2-day program where they just kind of go through everything. So I was not in good shape, and people noticed it. And so I went up there, and I had some friends that worked for the Mayo Clinic, association, and the Catholic Medical Association, because I'm the National Episcopal Advisor to the CMA. So I went up there, stayed with some friends, and went through a 2-day full physical. And that's when I was diagnosed with situational PTSD, anxiety, general anxiety, and major depressive disorder syndrome. And so in one sense, that was sort of okay, I know it, now I know what's going on. Let all this
there's
stuff
something to be addressed. Yeah.
Yeah. It was kind of like almost a relief. So, I prescribed medications, especially for sleep and antidepressives. And then started in therapy in May. A good psychotherapist, a good Catholic psychotherapist, because I knew I wanted someone who understood, the anthropology we believe in and has a spiritual life and has a grasp of Catholic teaching on, the theology of the body and an understanding of spiritual life. So, although the psychological life is different from the spiritual life, there's sort of a thin partition between our psychological health and our spiritual health, but at the same time, they kind of mutually enrich each other, but they're definitely distinct. One's physical and one's spiritual.
Yeah, I like the comment you made, something I watched in preparation for this conversation, that no one would think it was odd for you to go for spiritual direction. Why should it be odd for a person to go for mental health care, to go see a therapist? Right. So they're complementary is essentially what I'm hearing you say.
Like anything on the human side, if we're suffering from it, if somebody needs to go see a doctor about their blood sugar and they're diabetic, I mean, you're not ashamed of that. Just the same way you shouldn't be ashamed to go seek someone who is an expert in mental health. And I tell that to our seminarians, just as they go and choose a spiritual director, if they need to see someone who's experienced in psychology and as a therapist, and they shouldn't be embarrassed about getting some counseling. We always have counselors available, so trying to normalize it. So guys, don't feel like they have to avoid that if they're, experiencing some mild anxiety or even depression, whatever it is, that they get that help they need. Because the worst thing is to keep it inside and not to get help.
Kind of the white knuckle it is. You're reminding me of your sister, and I'll tell you a very quick story of a friend, which I mentioned to Gabby yesterday, but his wife told him, I love you dearly, honey, but you need some, if you did have cancer, I would tell you to, go to the doctor to have the cancer addressed. I'm telling you, need to go to a therapist to have this addressed. And having that person close to you, in her case, I know it led him to actually take some very constructive steps he would not have taken if he wasn't getting that very clear direction from someone he knew loves him, telling him to do that. So it reminds me of your sister as well.
Yeah, she could tell me. She knows me. She could tell me that, look, I think maybe you see somebody in the mental health profession because you're not yourself. And what she really noticed was this loss of joy that you mentioned at the beginning. That, it's funny how, and I don't have any history of mental health. My whole family doesn't have any history of mental health. I don't have any traumatic. Fortunately, thanks be to God, I haven't had any childhood trauma, which a lot of mental health issues kind of spring out of childhood trauma, and I never had any of that. That's why it was kind of a surprise to me that I would even be dealing with these kind of things. But mine was basically, kind of situational of what was happening at the time. But so she noticed that I just didn't have this normal sort of, optimism, you might call it, or joy, or, I was the kind of person that, always looks on the glass is always half full and, looking on the bright side of things. Tomorrow's a new day. And she just noticed that was no longer part of my MO. And she goes, I know something's wrong. And maybe you should see someone who's experienced in mental health. And so I trust her. She's not doing it for any other motive and, to want to see me get better. So that was also another reason why I got the physical. So I come back, and then 2019, started into therapy and that summer, and it kind of leveled off a bit in the summer, but then as this long kind of Attorney General's investigation of the dioceses, all this fear came, which is really, something from the evil one, because you have all these disasters there and scenarios running through your head, like it's all going to fall apart, or they're going to come and arrest me, take me away in a straitjacket. All these kind of crazy things that you have in your head from movies or books you've read, and and they're all just they're just fantasies. They're not true, but they seem real, and it causes you fear. And so in the fall,
and you're spending energy battling it and knowing it's not real, but yeah,
right. It's on your mind, and then you sort of get paranoid. Somebody looks at you funny, and they know something's wrong. All these kind of things. How the mind is. I remember Chris Stefanik. Chris Stefanik.
I do, yeah.
Yeah, Chris got this one line where he says, "The mind is like a dark forest. Never go in there alone."
I like that. I never heard that.
It's a great thing. They don't keep all this stuff alone. You share it with people because it's too scary to deal with it yourself. Because
then you find out, like you said, you have these illusions. As soon as you say it to someone who's trustworthy, you realize, there's all these illusions there. Yeah.
Yeah. Right, and then they kind of say, "No, that's ridiculous. That's not going to happen." They kind of talk you off the ledge, so to speak. But so I got to the point then in the fall that I realized I wasn't making any progress. I was either just kind of standing still, or even kind of backsliding. So that's when I went to the nuncio at our meeting in November, and Cardinal Pierre at the time was the nuncio, and I went there with my closest friend, Archbishop Coakley, and then Bishop Olmsted, who invited me to come to Phoenix to get away from, get out of kind of the pressure I was in, and then Bishop Wall, who's another close friend, who's down in Gallup, and so and Archbishop Lucas, who was the Archbishop of Omaha at the time, and who agreed to kind of watch the diocese for me. So I presented this to the nuncio, not knowing really what he'd say. And, he took one look at me and he says, "Yes, you look awful. You need to get some rest." Which, was kind of a confirmation. We all laughed, and he laughed, and we all laughed. And it kind of broke the ice a little bit because, I didn't know how he would react. But it just, it was sort of an affirmation that, let's get you some help. And so I presented that plan to him, and he said, "Well, I have to present this to the Holy Father because he's the only one that can allow you to step down from your responsibilities." So I said, "Okay." And so about 10 days later, I got a call from him. He said, "Yeah, the Pope has granted you a leave of absence." And so I left like within the next week, and then went down to Phoenix, thinking maybe I'd be down there for a couple months. We were just kind of going week by week, and so pretty soon I realized it was April, and then May.
And you're more isolated because you've left your duties, and we're all being told, and in fact, what was the phrase? We're all socially distancing.
I was already socially distanced by being away from my diocese, my home, my state. Everything that was familiar to me. Even though it was a nice. Bishop Olmsted has a nice little retreat house just at the base of Camelback Mountain. There are a couple other retired priests living there. So there was a little bit of a community, but we couldn't really talk, and everybody was wearing masks. So it was just a weird place to be as all of us experienced those days. When I was down there, I made sure that I was, and Bishop Wall helped me with this, and Bishop Olmsted, to find a medical doctor, a good Catholic medical doctor, a spiritual director, and a good Catholic psychotherapist. And I think that was really important to have a group of people. And I know that it's not easy to find those three, but I think people can find them in any community. And I think it's important that they do find people that, one, are good at their profession, whatever it may be, but also that they have the, correct Catholic view of life and of psychology and all these things, because you can always find someone that's not going to share your view of the world and what you believe in your faith. So that was important to me, and I was able to, thanks be to God, to get some people that were really good. And the other important part of my whole recovery was I had served as the chaplain at the University of Dallas Rome campus for a number of years when I worked in the Holy See, and there were a lot of families who were former students who now were raising kids themselves. And one in particular invited me to come, and I've basically spent 2 or 3 nights a week at their house, grilling outside. And I would go over and offer Mass for them because they couldn't, all the churches were shut down. So it was kind of a blessing for them to have Mass in their home. And I had someone else. I wasn't saying Mass privately. I could talk about in my letter. It was such a strange experience. It became even more difficult for me even to say Mass by myself, just because of the isolation.
Because we're communal people.
Yeah,
right.
We're meant to be with others. Exactly. But so that was my spring of 2020. I made a retreat at the end of that, which was good. And then it started getting hot. And I needed to get out of Phoenix because it was really getting hot. And so my therapist said, "Well, why don't you go back and shadow a couple of your friends, like Archbishop Coakley in Oklahoma City and Archbishop Naumann in Kansas City, Kansas." So I did that. And both of them were very welcoming to me. And I spent about 6 weeks with Archbishop Coakley, about 6 weeks with Naumann. And that helped, even though COVID, that's the second wave of COVID hit in the fall of 2020. But at least it was a little more open than before. And also, I mentioned this too, Bishop Wall and I drove to El Paso, Texas, and picked up 4 golden retriever puppies, 2 for me and 2 for him. The retreat director where I was living in Phoenix wanted one, and then his housekeeper wanted one. So here I am driving back, to Lincoln with my little puppy, and ready. but still I knew I wasn't ready to go back to work. And so I ended up going then to Kansas City and to Oklahoma City. And it wasn't really until the fall of 2020 that I contacted the nuncio and told him that I thought I was ready to come back and that he would have to go to the Holy Father. And that, I don't know if it was because of COVID or I don't know what, but it seemed like forever. I look back on it now, it was only about 6 weeks, but 6 weeks seemed like it was 6 years before. And then all these fears were still going through my head, like, the Pope's going to say, well, I think you should just retire. You're damaged goods, that kind of thing. And those were all these negative thoughts that were going through my head. But then finally I got the phone call, and the nuncio said, you can go back to your diocese now. And so it was exactly 11 months. So I took my leave in December 12th of 2019, came back. Yep, and then came back the same November 12th of 2020. So exactly 11 months.
There was a darkness there. You talked already about it, the loss of joy, but there was this phrase, just show up, that someone provide you the counsel while you were there in this period of leave. Just talk a little bit about that darkness and the just showing up.
Right. Yeah, that was my therapist, who was wonderful. I still kind of in contact with him. I'll give him a call every 6 weeks or 2 months or so. But that was one of the things that he really said, look, and then kind of reading he saw that, my mind was working in such a way that, I felt like, again, that I was the one, like the buck stops with me. I've got to solve all these problems. Instead of, and I used to quote this to people a lot, that apparently John the 23rd would say, St. John the 23rd, during the Second Vatican Council, when, all these pressures were there, he would go to bed at night and just say, Lord, his prayer was, Lord, it's your church, I'm going to bed. And
that's awesome.
That's a great attitude. And you just, you do what you can. And then, but my therapist he kept telling me that, look, you just show up, don't worry, you get up, get out of bed. That's the biggest victory of the day. And then you just take 1 minute, 1 second at a time and just show up, do your duties, and then go on to the next thing. And I found that's a great lesson for everyone. I've talked to people who are struggling and whether it be anxiety or depression. And I said, all you got to do is show up. Everybody can do it. Just get up and do what you can do, and don't worry about what you can't do. Just do what you can do. And whether it's your job or your duties as a husband or a father or mother, or a wife, just do those ordinary things that you can do every day. And that's all that's required. And that's helped me, even to this day, it helps me. You don't have to solve all the problems in the world. You just show up and do your work.
Tell us kind of, just to expand a little bit on what you just said, please, about just showing up and the nature of one's relationship with God. And then, I'm the person who needs help, but I think I'm just going to pray more. Like, what's your advice to me? And I have a couple more questions like that for the people who are listening and who just, know that they're made for joy, but they're struggling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think, I don't think I know one of the reasons why, the time in which we live right now is such a challenging time is because we spend so much time in our heads with regard to, the screen time, social media, all this information that's coming to us 24/7, whether it be the news, the political situation we're in right now, whatever it is, it's coming to us at a pace and a volume that we've never experienced in the history of the world. Jonathan Haidt, the author who wrote The Anxious Generation, which I recommend to everybody to read, really chronicles this very well. And it's no wonder, that so many people are struggling with mental health issues because we can't process everything, especially young people, and the expectations that are placed upon them because they've got everything at their fingertips now. And so they're expected to have everything figured out when actually in reality they're being overwhelmed. And it's crushing. And for all of us too, especially if we make any attempt to keep up with it, which is impossible.
Yes.
It's just too much.
Yes.
It's kind of impossible to keep up with everything that's coming at us. So that's where I think, this I mentioned earlier, anxiety. So it begins with anxiety, thinking, everybody gets anxious from time to time when they've got some pressure on them. But if we allow that anxiety to continue, then it reaches a certain point where it becomes overwhelming. And then it crosses over into depression, either mild depression or serious depression, where they just throw your hands up and I can't do this anymore, And it's a combination of a recognition that you can't do this. And, in some sense, that's true. You can't do everything you want to do because you're not able to. But then you don't want to do it. That's where the loss of joy comes in. It's just not only I can't do this anymore, but I don't even want to do this anymore. I don't want to do this. And this is where suicidal thoughts come in. And I have to say I didn't have any serious suicidal ideation, but I thought about it. I thought, well, God, wouldn't it be nice just to kind of be free of all this? And I can understand now, like I couldn't before, why someone would even think about taking their own life. Because in some sense, it seems like the only way out of this darkness that you're in. And that's where I think you have to cling to your faith, even when there's no consolation. And again, as I said, you can't pray yourself out of it, but you have to hold on. You can't give up that one thread. Like I said, my three anchors, even though I received no strength and consolation from it, other than just holding on, was the rosary, the divine office, Psalms, and Holy Mass. And even though I was sometimes just going through the motions and saying the words, it was something to hang on to. And I knew that I couldn't get those things up because those were the lifelines. But for all of us, it's like that. You got to hold on to what you can and just go through the darkness. I had one great psalm last night, my only companion is darkness. And we see it in the lives of the saints, huh? Like Saint Therese at the end of her life, Mother Teresa. I mean, they all experienced this. And you just have to continue to walk forward and just to keep going forward in the darkness. And eventually the darkness will lift. And that's the important thing, that there is hope, that it's not going to last forever, that it will, the light and the dawn will come. And you don't think about it at the time. You think this darkness is never going to end, but you just keep going forward and the light will come.
That was the Best of the Week on Relevant Radio. The best way to listen to the Best of the Week is on the Relevant Radio app. Free and always free. Download and share the #1 free Catholic app today in the App Store.